Welcome to Food, Wine, and Whiskey, a podcast about having fun conversations on tasty dishes, vinos, and spirits from around the world. Rob is your host. He is an avid home chef, WSET Level 2 award in wine, and a whiskey drinker and collector. Time to set the table. Here's Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Thank you so much for stopping in for this episode. Going to be a fun conversation, as you can see by the title. Talking about an area in Italy with some fantastic wines. And if you don't know about this area, I would say it might be the best kept secret in Italy right now. But word's getting out. It's starting to spread because they're doing some great things over there. So talking about the wines of Etna today, and I have a great guest on. He's been on before. This is going to be the editor-in-chief of Wine Magazine, Opening a Bottle. And he's also a Colorado-based wine educator, Kevin Day, back on the program. How are you, Kevin?
Great, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. I got wine in the glass. I'm doing real well.
And you got Benanti in the glass.
I do. And as we say that, I'll let you give them a big thank you. You kind of coordinated this to get us a couple of whites, a white and a red, a couple of bottles to have while we're talking about the wines of Sicily.
Yeah, well, when you reached out to talk about where we wanted to talk about next, which area of my expertise, which is in France and Italy. Etna first came to my mind, partly because I went there in September, partly because Etna is always on my mind. I mean, I try not to get bogged down in hyperbole too often, but there are few places in the world that are more compelling for wine than this place. And I mean that not just in terms of what the wines are in the glass, but what this volcano is like where these wines are grown. It is unusual, to say the least. So I was really excited to talk about it. And it's always nice that we're drinking the same thing when we do this. And so I reached out to my friends at Wilson Daniels, who are an importer of fine wines. They bring in some of the nicest wines into America. They represent a winery called Benanti. I've known Antonio Benanti for a few years now. He's one of two brothers who oversees this great winery on the slope of Etna. And I'll talk about them in a second, but they're largely credited with the renaissance that has happened in Etna. They played a very key role in bringing it back from kind of a state of abandonment in the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s. And so, when I thought of an Etna Rosso and an Etna Bianco that could speak volumes about what this place is like, the kind of typical signatures of Etna, Benanti came to the top of my mind. And I asked, and they were kind enough to send us each a bottle of their entry level Etna Rosso and Etna Bianco. So thank you to them for helping us make this podcast possible and this tasting possible.
Yeah, I know we'll get into it in a little bit, but I will say I've snuck a couple of sips, and good stuff we're going to have today.
It is, yeah. This is definitely Burgundy stemware territory that we're talking about here with wines.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with, Sicily, Mount Etna specifically. Where are we? In relation to Italy, everybody hears Italy and they think about those regions that get them there for wine, whether it's Tuscany or Piemonte, or those are the two biggest regions. Obviously, up and down Italy, there's some great regions for wine, and Sicily is one of them. Where is this, for those who don't know?
Yeah, so the way I look at Sicily, I kind of go back and forth. I think of Sicily as being on equal footing with Piedmont and Tuscany, for one. As a wine lover of Italian wines, Sicily continues to come to the table with just the most stellar wines of consistency, of quenchability, of versatility at the table, and they're not super expensive. And I'm talking about the Sicily in general, all of Sicily. And so that's one thing to know, is that Sicily really deserves the kind of respect that we often reserve for Piedmont and for Tuscany. It's right there in that conversation.
I mean, people who don't know that are perking up in their chairs or whatever they're doing right now going, wait, what? Really?
Yeah, they ought to.
Yeah, they absolutely should.
I've had enough Sicilian wine at this point that I feel comfortable saying that.
Yeah.
It's really, and I've been there twice in recent years, and every time I go, I'm like, okay, when am I coming back? Because this place is really fantastic. So that's one attribute to know about Sicily. And really the place that is pulling Sicily, blazing speed into the future of fine wine is Mount Etna. And so Mount Etna is located in the northeastern corner of Sicily. Sicily is kind of like a triangle shape. It's the largest island in the Mediterranean, so it's pretty enormous. It's also the largest region in Italy. So geographically, it's got more square mileage than Tuscany or Piedmont. So it's enormous. And this volcano is about 1/10 of the island. So it takes up an enormous amount of land. It's a shield volcano, so it rises up fairly gradually. It's a stratovolcano, but it's unmistakable. And it rises to 11,000 feet in elevation, yet it's only a few miles away from the Straits of Messina. So already you're hearing kind of how crazy this place is, right? You've got an island that is basically at the same latitude as parts of North Africa. You have 11,000 feet in elevation on an active volcano, the most active volcano in all of Europe, nonetheless, one of the most dangerous volcanoes in all of Europe. And surrounding it on the northern slope, the eastern slope, the southeastern and southwestern slope is a band of vineyards forming kind of, if you look on a map, it's like a backwards shaped C that wraps around Mount Etna. And this is prime area for white wines, red wines, but as well as Rosado, so rosé wines, and Spumante, which is the sparkling wines of the area. The Spumante wines are a little few and far between. They're hard to find on the American market, but they do make Spumante wines there with these grapes. So you may be wondering, why not the western slope of Mount Etna? The climate is much more conducive for pistachios on that side of Mount Etna.
Really?
So, yeah, and Sicily has the best nuts I've ever tasted. The almonds, but especially the pistachios. It's Pistacchio di Bronte is the DOP, protected designated of origin pistachio. And these are like radiant green and purple pistachios. They have a sweetness to them, a delicacy to them, and they have the volcano to thank for that. So
yeah, I get to learn something new all the time. Every time we visit, I did not know that. That's awesome.
Well, and the Sicilians are dessert crazy. Like dessert can sometimes be a 3 or 4 course meal in its own right at the end of a 3 or 4 course meal. And pistachios, they feature prominently in a lot of the desserts. It's one of my favorite things there is to get a gelato of Pistacchio di Bronte DOP. This pistachio ice cream, it just is killer. So Mount Etna is very generous with what it gives to us in terms of agriculture. And so on those slopes that are more conducive to vineyards and to wine growing, you have obviously volcanic soil at play. And volcanic soil is super important because of, for one, it seems to convey an energy to wines universally. Whenever you go to a place that has volcanic terroir, the wines have a different kind of energy to them. And it's one of those mysterious things that is hard to explain scientifically. Yet if you taste enough volcanic wines and compare them from place to place, you tend to notice that this is the case. And Mount Etna has that in spades, is energy to these wines.
I want to ask you, when we talk about Mount Etna being, it's active. And so every once in a while you'll see some billowing of smoke, or I'm assuming you still get some lava that can creep down a little bit.
Oh yeah.
And so when we hear, there's a lot of places around the globe that might mention that they have volcanic soil, but this being active and some of those being dormant for a while, what are the differences that we might see there? Or are there? Are they going to be similar?
There are differences. I think you're not going to necessarily, I hesitate to say you're going to taste those differences.
Okay.
As an ordinary wine consumer. Yet it is very important, the differences in terms of how it shapes and molds the terrain for winemaking on Etna versus an area where it's dormant. So, and I'm glad you bring this up, because I think one of the key attributes of terroir that's so utterly fascinating about Etna, and which makes it so complicated to understand, and which to me makes it feel like it's a life mission to understand this place, because I'm always going to be learning something about it, is the age of the lava flows that are coming down Mount Etna. So if you're familiar with Kilauea as a volcano and how Kilauea erupts on the big island of Hawaii, there are some similarities between that and Mount Etna. Mount Etna will, on occasion, crack open halfway down the slope and ooze lava all over the place. And that's a real problem if you live there. That's a real problem if you're basing a business off of, plants growing on the side of this volcano. It hasn't happened very recently. I think it's been a few decades since they've had that type of an eruption. But what you see when you look on a satellite image of Etna is all these different black, gray, pale colored streams of rock emanating from the epicenter of the crater at various places along the north, the east, the southeast, southwest slopes. So it also tends to erupt with ash. That's a lot more frequent. You have ash covering the ground, fertilizing the soil that way on occasion. Recently, just this year, like 2 months ago, Etna had a new fumarole form on the top of the mountain, and it started pumping out smoke rings like it was smoking a cigar. I mean, these absolute perfect rings of vapor were being emitted at regular intervals out of the volcano. And it really makes the mountain seem like it's a living being, like it's this little playful child that has a bubble wand or something. He's just pumping out, smoke rings into the sky. And so that kind of lit up, Instagram and was trending for a time because it was just so compelling and different. So there's a lot of personality to this wine. But when you go back to those lava flows that are kind of arrayed at various, it's like spokes on a wheel. They all kind of come down at different places and they're different ages. The age of those lava flows is going to give you a different terroir from one vineyard to the next. So in the research I've done and interviews I've done asking about this phenomenon, when you have a lava flow, you have solid rock, obviously, but over time it's going to break down. And it breaks down from what's known as pioneer plants. So these are natural, wild, native plants that will get their roots and they'll work their way into the cracks. And as they grow, they break the rock apart and break it down. Very, very long, ancient process at play. But when we're talking about grapevines of all the agricultural plants that are out there, they can handle this sort of thing. So they can be pioneer plants in their own right when they're planted in a lava flow that is a few centuries old. So you can find some vineyards. In fact, one of the most famous vineyards on Mount Etna, Pietra Marina, which is from Benanti, that's their signature Etna Bianco wine. It's not a very old lava flow that these vines are planted in. And that's part of what makes that terroir unique. You go over, a half mile, there's no lava flow there that's been in that vicinity for millennia. And so the soil's different. The terroir is different. The properties of the microclimate are different. And so because of all this potential, where you have multiple craters erupting across a large, vast volcano, you end up having just this incredible tapestry of soil that right now, even the winemakers are just figuring out. They're still mapping this sort of thing. They're still understanding it. But what it leads, then the upshot is the native grapes of Mount Etna, the ones that have adapted to these conditions, that thrive on that mountain, give us a wine that comes from a volcanic soil because, despite the age all across the mountain, it's uniformly volcanic. There are some deposits of clay here and there. There's some other geology types, but it's predominantly volcanic. And the wines, as a result, have just this incredible energy. They just kind of race across your palate. They end up being very, very versatile with cuisine because they have just high acidity. And so part of what's exciting for me as a wine writer and as a wine educator, and why I feel compelled to go back to Mount Etna, which I will do later this year, I hope, is to go and better understand all these different traits and attributes from the different slopes, the different vineyards, all of those kinds of things.
You left out wine lover. I mean, you're a writer and an educator, but you're also a wine lover.
Well, I am, and honestly, I'm a nature lover first and foremost, and
yeah.
in wine of all the products that humans make for consumption.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I would say,
wine really tells a story about nature in an interesting way that I find interesting.
One of the things I'll mention to people who maybe haven't listened to an episode you've been on before, and if they have, they'll know this. You have a passion for photography, and I got to imagine that some of the photos that you can get on Mount Etna have to be just stunning, just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, they have been. I should send you, maybe we could put a link in the bottom of the YouTube or with the podcast.
Yeah.
I have a gallery of images from there that people can scroll through and check out. Because so a few stories, a few little kind of anecdotes from my time there. I went to one vineyard, one winery called Fuego Cavalieri, which is on the southwest slope of the volcano. And this is a former monastery. And the vines there are very, very old. They have a few vines here that are even 300 years old. That's another really unique attribute of Mount Etna, is the fact that you have vineyards that predate phylloxera. They go back 100, 150 years in some cases. So they give this very ancient fruit, this very concentrated fruit. This place was one of those spots. And so for me to go and walk amidst vines that were, this was not like any vineyard I'd ever seen before in my life. It was chaos. I don't know how these winemakers make sense of a landscape where you have grapes basically growing off of bushes, off of little trees. They're almost on the ground. They're just, the vines have just gone every which way. There's been a real feral kind of nature to this place and to some of the vineyards that at every turn, it's a challenge as a photographer to make sense of it with the eye, because sometimes it doesn't seem like the vineyard has a focal point. You don't have these nice orderly rows that you're walking through. The vines are not trained in the Guyot fashion for the most part. They're trained as little trees, but these are trees that for decades throughout the 20th century went untended. So they went every which way that way, So that was a really special visit, that vineyard. And you had the perfect view of the summit of Mount Etna. The other thing that's kind of interesting, as a wine lover on Mount Etna, is kind of parsing the differences of those slopes. So I've referenced that a few times. I'm just going to quickly kind of explain it before I go any further and start talking over my head or talking too far down the road before I've explained a key concept here. But if you think of that backward shaped C where the vineyards are, the north slope is where you get a lot of the red wine production. And the north slope has a lot of its own kind of microclimate conditions that make it unique. The east slope is only about 4 to 5 miles away from the Strait of Messina. So it's in this elevation zone. All the vineyards are between roughly 1,000 and 3,600 feet in elevation on the mountain. That's the little band where these vineyards are. So you're at that elevation, but you're only 4 miles away from the sea. And so this is where most of the white wines are planted, is in this area around this town called Milo. So you may see Etna Bianco Superiore on a label. That's only allowed for wines from this zone because this is the best conditions for the white grapes. And then you go to the southeast and southwest slopes, and they're different because of one faces the sunrise and one faces the sunset. So the southwest slope tends to have a very bold character to it because it gets that late day sun. It gets the sun all the way until it sets under the horizon, whereas the north slope is in the shadow of the volcano when the sun sets oftentimes. So you just kind of have all these different variables at play. So you got the lava flows, you've got the proximity to the Strait of Messina, you got the elevation at play, and then you've got which slope are you angled on. Obviously it's like talking about Burgundy, but with on steroids in a way in terms of all the variables that are at play.
Well, that's a great kind of overview of the location and the geography of where these wines are made. What about the history of this place? For those of us who do know, Sicily's been a very important part of history when we think about trade and things like that going through that area. But we really don't think about wine there. But you would have to assume, just because of that part of the world, they've been making wine just like other parts of that part of the world for a very long time. So what's the history with wine, and what's the history of Sicily, this place?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the wines we're drinking today are likely very different than the wines that have ever been drunk on Mount Etna, just because of the modern infusion of capital and resources and scientific understanding about making fine wine. That didn't exist before this 1980s, 1990s, really 2000s time period. So it's really interesting. You're tasting a wine here that is at once ancient, but also very modern, if that makes sense. The landscape is very ancient. The cultural history behind the wines and behind tending to the vines is very ancient. The grapes are very ancient and the vines are very old. But the wines that they're making today are in a very clean style. They're not rustic. They're not, so there's not those hard tattered. Yes, exactly. So that's kind of an interesting thing to know. But if you go all the way back to when, the first archaeological records of viticulture are on Mount Etna, it predates the Greeks. And the Greeks landed on Sicily, I think it was around like 1800 BC that they landed there and started kind of promoting their own viticultural ways. And, so there's evidence that these wild vines and Etna have been together for a very, very long time.
So was it, when we talk about prior to, let's just say 1980s, 1990s, was it just kind of table wines? They were just making wines, and then at some point somebody said, hold on a second, we've got some really good indigenous grapes, and, if we just kind of put a little effort and think about this a little bit, we could really make something special here. Is that kind of how that evolved?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description of it. I think so the vineyards are predominantly terraced, so they were never really in a position to provide huge amounts and quantities of grapes for bulk wine production like you might find elsewhere in Sicily. However, they did produce grapes that were sold for those purposes. There was also some localized efforts to make wines on a local level, either through casks, through occasional estate bottling. But this was you got to remember, after World War II, Sicily saw a lot of people leave the island. There just wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to stay in Sicily and make a living there, and so that kind of for lack of a better term, brain drain. Affected the agricultural landscape across the island. And Mount Etna, being a high elevation volcano, was kind of one of those last places to feel, the hands of modern 20th century, enterprise, just because of its, of its terrain, and given that what was already there. So you mentioned, at a certain point there was a tipping point, that there was somebody who said, hey, we could do better here. And by many accounts, that was Giuseppe Benanti, who was a pharmacist, local, who, had gone up on the mountain a few times, tasted the wines, and was just like, I know wine, and this could be so much better. Like, what's going on here? So he established his winery in the late 1980s. And began getting down to work, like hired enologists, started working with a very talented young man named Salvo Foti, who is kind of, one of the, essential winemakers of Mount Etna. His estate now is I Vigneri, which is kind of a benchmark for top Etna wines. But they experimented. They brought in people from, outside Sicily who had, fine wine expertise. So that was one driving force. There's another winery called Barone di Villagrande, and they've been in business for over a century and have really pushed the fold as well when it comes to Etna Bianco wines and Etna Rosso wines. So they deserve some credit too in this whole thing. It's not just one single person who kickstarted all of this, but Giuseppe Benanti played a pretty big role, and he was also very business savvy. He took this stuff to Italy, got people's attention, he promoted it internationally. And then soon other people followed. Passo Picciaro is a very well-known estate that was established in the early 2000s from the Franchetti family. Andrea Franchetti established that. He's had been doing some great work in Tuscany. So then you get somebody coming from Tuscany down to Sicily. You have Frank Cornelissen, who's kind of revered in natural wine circles. He came from Belgium and kind of made his mark on the mountain with his wines. So bit by bit, you had a few people showing up who started doing some things that really turned some heads. And then really in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, then you started seeing an explosion of interest in these wines. Then you started seeing, the Sicilian kind of, the giants of Sicilian wine, like Donna Fugata, the Tosca family, Planeta, then they're getting involved in Mount Etna. And slowly but surely, momentum built around this DOC. There's been some growing pains. There's been some kind of, hey, do we want to be a DOCG? Do we want to refine what it is that we're putting in the bottle in terms of, the restrictions, the parameters? It's still a moving target. I think they're right now looking at trying to advance from DOC to DOCG level, which if you're an Italian neophyte, that they've got two different levels of protected origin. DOCG is often considered a higher standard. I think it just means it's more regulated. So they're looking to do that. So there's some evolution still to happen on Mount Etna. But I think what's happened in the last 10 years is you're seeing this kind of nascent wine industry that has had people come from all sorts of places with various different kinds of intentions. They're now starting to coalesce around an ideal on what they should be. And we're benefiting from it. I mean, the wines are just, when I did the grand tasting at Etna Days, I mean, there were too many great wines to count,
Yeah.
So that's fine.
That's why we're doing this episode for sure, is to get word out about how great these wines are. And it's funny, sometimes on some wine groups that I'm in on Facebook and other things, if I post a wine from a producer from Etna, a lot of people will be like, hey, stop doing that. We don't need the word to get out because then prices go up. This is just such a great gem of a place for to your point earlier, great value.
I think there's enough people who are enthusiasts in this place that you and I can't stop that tide.
No, not at all. And I don't want to. Look, we need to share these wines, and the people of Sicily need and Mount Etna, they deserve having the world know how great their wines are. So absolutely. Yeah,
and I think for me, what I feel like my job is in all of this is just making sure people understand it and get the story right on what this place is like, what its potential is, and also how it fits into the greater galaxy of Italian wines and the greater galaxy of world fine wine. So should we start with the Etna Bianco and talk about that specifically?
Yeah, let's start with that and the grapes that make it up, but also about the terroir, because I did want to ask you, we started talking about, around the globe, I think people who are a little bit nerdy about wine understand kind of what clay is and what limestone is, or gravel or sand. But when they hear, volcanic soil, they go, well, what does that mean? What is it? Mm-hmm. How dense is it? How light is it? What is, how does it work?
Yeah. I think the thing to think about with all soils is water retention. Because I think beyond that, we start splitting hairs to a degree that it becomes very case by case scenario. And I think as a wine lover, the thing to think about with volcanic soil versus clay soil, which would be kind of the on the other end of the spectrum really, is when it rains and you have precipitation to feed the plants, does that water go deep underground, or does it kind of get soaked up like a sponge and just sit there? Clay has this absorbent property to it that it really holds on to water pretty well. That's why you see clay typically on flatter land, or slightly, more gradual slopes is where you might see that. And clay is oftentimes formed from deposits, right? So gravity pulling things down. So it naturally makes sense. When you're on a volcanic slope and a true slope, as the Etna vineyards are, and not only that, but oftentimes terraced, where humans have come in, they've made the land flat for their vines, they've put up walls. When it rains on there, it will go deep underground, and so the roots go deep underground. And so the roots end up having just a very different kind of exposure to the nutrients that are in the ground, to the organic materials that are in the ground. The uptake of what's in there is different. And you also have to think volcanic soil is going to foster a very different biome of subterranean life, microbes, of insects, of worms, of all those other things. It's like the difference between a rainforest and the tundra, right? Like clay is going to have a very different biome for those kinds of microbes and everything. So it's super complicated, and I don't want to get too hung up on because it's volcanic and its exposure to this much amount of potassium or whatever that might be. I think from a wine standpoint, that whenever you have that formula where water goes deep underground and the roots have to really chase it, you end up having a plant that seems to work in a little bit more of an efficient manner. And that efficiency usually shows up with grapes that have a little bit more raciness to them, a little bit more zip. And this is really when we start getting into this space called minerality, right? Which is a word that is kind of controversial because it's not really a word. But let's be honest, we've used it enough now. We could call the Oxford English Dictionary and say, minerality is a word now. Minerality to me is a sensation. And it's every bit as much of an emotional feeling in a wine as it is a technical feeling. So it's basically the kind of thing that would conjure a sense of stoniness, of kind of like atmospheric conditions, of salt. When you kind of experience those things in a wine, and when you really pay attention to a wine and get them, it's just kind of it's an interesting space that's really hard to pin down. It's not like, yeah, and that's what Etna Bianco is absolutely known for minerality. I mean, if you wanted to ask, 10, master sommeliers, what three wines in the world best demonstrate minerality, they would probably say Chablis and Etna Bianco, because of how regularly these two wines showcase this attribute. Now, Chablis is in a form of limestone, but it's a similar kind of action that's happening there. The water is going really, really deep into that limestone. Those Chardonnay vines are really, really chasing the water. So here on Etna, I haven't even gotten to the grape that we're talking about.
Yeah, let's do that.
The chief grape is Caricante, local grape. So Caricante means to carry. And the reason it's known as to carry is because it gives a lot of yield. So, normally we think a lot of yield, that doesn't really mean a fine wine. But when you have older vines of Caricante growing in these conditions, the yield balance is just right. And Caricante is complemented oftentimes by Catarato. It's complemented by Minella. There's a few other local Sicilian varieties that we don't really need to get too hung up on. In fact, I would say another key thing that's important to know about Etna's wines is that many of these are field blends. So the exact percentages of what grapes we're drinking are not oftentimes defined for us on a tech sheet in the industry. So
just for explanation, when you say field blend, these are just kind of growing together, and then they just go in and harvest them together. They're mixed in and intertwined.
Exactly. I mean, in some of the vineyards I was in with the winemaker, hey, what's this? Is this Catarato? It could be Catarato. It's not Caricante,
Yeah.
They don't know because they're so old. And this is how, this is the old way of doing agriculture was diversity was a good thing. You wanted a lot of variety of plants in a small space so that you could have a lot of variety, so that you could have, resistance against, maladies and, climate conditions. So a lot of the older vineyards on Etna are not fully understood in terms of which grapes they're producing. With confidence, with a high degree of confidence, most of them are going to be Caricante on the white side of things, Nerello Mascalese on the red side of things. And it is known that those are the majority of grapes. But in an Etna Bianco, it's not uncommon that 10% of it is a mix of some sort of milieu of local Sicilian white varieties, Catarato being the most common of those.
So when we dive into this Bianco and we know the grape now, what should we? I mean, you mentioned Burgundy earlier, and you mentioned Chablis, and I'll tell you, when I nosed this the first time, it screamed Chablis to me. That's the first thing I thought of. But I did love that the minerality to me on the nose on this was up front. It wasn't fruit. Yeah. It was the minerality that struck me first, which I really enjoy on all wines, but specifically white wines.
Yeah. And then Bianco is going to be really giving you a sense of sapidity. So like, you just want to have another sip. You just want to consume something else with it, right?
Yeah.
There's this. So that to me, that's the momentum that Etna Bianco builds so well. Chablis does that very well as well. There are a few aromatic signatures that are a little bit different. I kind of feel oftentimes like Etna Bianco is a little bit stonier. Sometimes it can convey a little bit more of like a briny kind of smell, like an oceanic smell. That again, what's causing that? I hesitate to even guess because I'm not a scientist, right? But you do wonder if on that east slope, given the closeness to the Strait of Messina, the fog conditions that come off of that strait, if that has something to do with it. Typically these wines are going to lead with some of those stonier elements first, and then you'll notice the fruit a little bit later. And I've even noticed with some of these Etna Bianco wines that they move in a dynamic way. And this is something I think is very different than Chablis, is from 1 minute to the next, it's a different wine. It's always a compelling wine, but you come back to it, you go, that wasn't like the last sip, or you pour yourself a second glass an hour after you open the bottle and you're like, whoa, this has changed. Now it's really fruity, or now I'm really getting a sense for flowers, or gosh, that sip was really salty, right? Like this, there's not actually salt in the wine, but it has that sensation to it. It creates that sort of thing. So I've even had, one of Benanti's wines, their Contrada Rinazzo, which is a larger parcel with Pietro Marina in the middle of it, which is their most famous wine. That wine, one time I opened it and it didn't smell like anything. I was like, oh God, is there something wrong with the wine? And I was like, I've never had that before, where a white wine was so closed that it just was like, there was just kind of this like pause, right? And then it, like the volcano, it just, oh, here it is, and it was just the most incredible wine because it was so filled with aromas. There were so many moving parts to it that were just really dynamic and interesting. And I think that kind of element makes this such an exciting place to be. I like being in spots where I don't know what's going on. I mean, maybe I'm unique as a wine expert in that regard, that I don't have every answer, but Etna is one of those places that continuously tells you, hey, there's a lot going on here that you're too small to understand.
Yeah, well, and I was going to mention, you brought it up, but the floral notes, that's kind of what I get as a secondary. I don't get as much of that fruit. I do get it back there, a little bit of that stone fruit, but I get this kind of perfumey, kind of white flower kind of note that I'm getting on it. The other thing I would say is it's got a little weight to it. It's not as crisp. I like the weight on this, the kind of the mouthfeel. Yeah,
it's not it's not at all like Vermentino or, some of these other white wines that we know and have, explored. Certainly it's nothing like Sauvignon Blanc. But it's also, it's not like Chardonnay. And the reason why is because Chardonnay is such a blank canvas, and it allows the winemaker to make so many different decisions, whether they oak it, those kinds of things. And certainly there's a whole variety of techniques being employed by these winemakers, whether it's oak, whether it's the use of acacia, whether it's concrete, stainless, amphora, they're experimenting with it all on Etna. But there's a character here that overrides that, if so to speak, that I think shines with Etna Bianco in a way that's really intriguing.
Yeah, delicious wine. I mean, very, very good. The acidity, the balance in this wine. I mean, a really stunning wine. And I don't know what this costs, but I'm guessing $30 range, $35 range. Or is that somewhere where we would be?
I think it might even be a little bit less than that.
Less than that?
Let's look it up right now, because we're on a podcast. We got to get this right. I should have looked this up beforehand. Real quick, the retail price on it is, I'm seeing it being sold for $29. So yeah, it's around $30. Yeah, a great value for what you get. The Etna Rosso is even a little bit less than that. It's around $27, $28 in that range, which we'll get to in a second. So, a couple other things on Etna Bianco, I think that really make it so unique is the persistence after. So the finish, it just keeps carrying and going on and going on. That makes it very intriguing. But I've also, and I wrote about this recently on Opening a Bottle, the aging possibilities with Etna Bianco are really intriguing. So I've kind of come around to the idea that what's exciting for me as a personal wine collector is white wines that are really thrilling after 5 years. Not looking at things like, oh, what can I lay down that I'll enjoy 40 years from now? Like, I'm already 45. I want some results now, right? And this is really where Etna Bianco has a leg up on a lot of other white wines. Is what it does in that 5-year, even 10-year time frame is really, really intriguing. I had some examples at Etna Days that were 10 years old. And this is a wine that's got incredible aging potential. I wouldn't be surprised even if, 20 years from now, people are talking about 30-year-old Etna Biancos as being really, really compelling. So it's not that it only lasts for 5 years, but you're actually going to really see some noticeable changes in it in 5 years. So that to me is a fun thing to manage is, a rack of 4 different Etna Bianco that I just keep for 5 years and roll them out. And if I forget about them after 5 years and I try them 7 years, they're still going to deliver some results to me. They're still going to be more, complex and nuanced and intriguing after that window. So something to kind of keep in mind is if you've got any collectors listening in, that it's a really interesting wine for that.
No, I think that's great to know because, so many times we hear with white wines, 3 to 5 years, drink them, as a general rule, not this, doesn't apply to every wine, but it's good to know that this wine, you would say after 5 years to that 10-year mark is just a fun window to really kind of, maybe buy 3 or 4 of these and open one at 5 and 7 and 9 and,
right,
just see what it's like.
But a lot of times too, the wines we talk about aging, they require aging, right? Like, oh, it's released, you don't want to open it yet. And these wines aren't like that. These wines you can open right at release.
Yeah.
Save them for 3 years. You can save them for 6 years. You can save them for 10. I mean, go for it. All the properties are there for a really solid age-worthy wine, especially from some of the top producers on the island, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, I need to put them in the back of the cellar because they're so good. If they're in front of me and I see the label, I'm probably going to pull it and want to drink it. So I probably need to hide them a little bit.
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Yeah. You want to go over to this Rosso and talk about that?
Yeah, let's
bit?
talk about Etna Rosso. So I mentioned earlier the key grape here is Nerello Mascalese. That's the black grape of Mascali, which is a town in Sicily. Nerello Mascalese is fairly similar to Sangiovese genetically. So they're trying to figure out what its origin story was. Was it from originally Calabria, which is like the toe of Italy that kind of points at Sicily? They're still trying to figure out genetically how this ties into it, but it has a lot of similarities to Sangiovese. One would be a tendency for herbaceousness in the grapes, right? The flavor tones that are kind of herbal. It can have a really, the citric acidity to it is really reminiscent of kind of oranges. Like there's kind of this similar kind of kinship there, a sensation that might remind you of citrus. It's got a similar tannin profile as Sangiovese, but because it's coming from this southern latitude in a volcanic terroir at elevation, it ends up having a leaner profile that often makes it compared to Pinot Noir. And it's compared to Pinot Noir in the best way, right? It certainly has its own character. It's not going to, if you were to blind taste somebody on Pinot Noir and Nerello Mascalese, they're not going to think that they're identical by any means. But I think it has that kind of, that angle towards refinement, the ability to age beautifully in the bottle for a period of time. The mid palate is kind of similar to Pinot Noir. And it also has this ability to express terroir very distinctly, where you can have, multiple vineyards next to each other on the North Slope that will give you very different wines. Some of that is Nerello Mascalese talking about its soil story and the microclimate. Some of it could also be what we're talking about with field blends, where, you have an older vineyard and you might have some other grapes blended into that. The main one that you hear about is Nerello Cappuccio, which is another indigenous variety that is often co-planted with Nerello Mascalese. It's a little bit more difficult to deal with. It's a little bit more affected by certain maladies in the vineyard, but nonetheless, you can have some of that as a variable that gets in there. But nonetheless,
I'm guessing that percentage of that grape is probably 20% or less, typically.
Oh, much less. Yeah, usually less than 10. Yeah.
Less than 10. Okay.
Less than 10. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a beautiful wine.
Yeah, this one's really showing beautifully right now. And I'm going to check in on these wines tonight. I'm going to save some for tomorrow because that's, this is the kind of wine you can stretch out, right? And I think as a fellow wine lover, we appreciate that. Is when you have a bottle at, it's 750 milliliters. I don't have to drink it all tonight. In fact, I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in our fridge, usually there's 2 or 3 bottles in our fridge over the course of a week that need to be finished up over 5 or 6 days because we let them go a little bit. You mentioned this being similar to or sometimes compared to Pinot Noir, and it's not hard to see that at all. I mean, there's this power with finesse. I mean, this wine is complex, and it has, the acidity on the palate is just really, really good. The tannins are there, but they're not overpowering. And to me, this had alcohol, I think, at 14%, but it's just so well incorporated. I mean, it's just really well-balanced wine.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that if there's a difference that I'm noticing, it would be the fruit is a little bit edgier than the fruit you'd get from Pinot Noir. And that's not to say it's less refined. It's just, it's got a little bit of attitude to it. There's a little bit of a snarl to the fruit character on Nerello Mascalese that I like. I mean, Italian red wines are like that. Italian red wines, they have a little bit of kind of
when you think, when you think Italian anyway, you think a little more rustic than you do French. You think a little more finesse, or at least I do.
Yeah. Or another way of putting it is softness versus, the fruit is a little softer with French wines.
Yes, I would agree.
Wine wines, yeah. But nonetheless, still very refined tannins, very polished, very drinkable, even on its own, but also very versatile at the table. I mean, you could do this would be great with, a more protein-rich fish like a tuna. It'd be great with a roasted chicken. You could have it with beef. You could have it with bison. You could have it all sorts of different ways. It's that versatility is something that I really respect because, sometimes with a wine that's maybe only pairs with certain things, it just sits there waiting for that moment for too long.
Well, and you mentioned $27 for this wine. You talk about value for something like this. My goodness.
Yeah.
There's
Definitely
wines that you can just pour and drink, and you don't really have to think about. They're not meant to be thought that much about. But this at $27, you can't help but want to keep sticking your nose back in there. I mean, it's just really, really a beautiful nose.
Yeah, it's great stuff. And Benanti is one of the top wineries in all of Italy because of the fact that they are on Mount Etna. Yes, because they have this history of triggering the Renaissance on Mount Etna in large part. Yes, but also they make really good red wine, white wine, Rosato, and Spumante. And that's rare to find is a producer who can juggle those 4 disciplines in equal amounts of grace.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing to know about this particular winery.
I get a little.
And it's also, Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to note that it's, those other wines are, worth talking about too, are the Spumante and the Rosato wines, particularly the Rosato wines. They tend to be a little bit more, if you're comparing it to like a Provence rosé style, they're going to have more body to them. They're going to have a little bit more. They've got more flavor to them.
In the middle of a Tavel and a Provence, kind of in the middle.
No, on the other side of Tavel.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like they're but not quite as far as like Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. If you're familiar with that wine from Abruzzo, which is almost like a light red wine. The Rosato wines from Etna are they're pretty flavor packed, which I like. I think a lot of times rosés kind of come up short in the flavor department. There's maybe 2 things going on in there. These will have 4 or 5 different things. The acidity will be citric. The cherry fruit sensations will be there. There'll be a little bit of that herbal note to kind of carry you through. There'll be some of that stoniness from the terroir. So that it's certainly a wine that's worth watching and worth keeping in mind.
It sounds like another versatile food wine too.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. One last thing to wrap up on Etna Rosso and also with the Etna Bianco, and I didn't mention earlier, if you're shopping for Etna wines and you see the word Contrada on the label, that's an important thing to know. That's almost like a village level designation. So they have, they've broken down, and I apologize, my office line phone is ringing. They've broken down the different villages across Etna into, they're known as Contrada locally. And so it's almost like a single vineyard wine. In fact, usually if it comes from a winery and it's a Contrada, that's their one vineyard that they have in that town. So it kind of is a single vineyard wine technically. Those are going to be a little bit more terroir specific. They're going to be smaller in production size. So there's going to be fewer of those bottles. They're going to be more expensive. And oftentimes they are the best wines on the mountain, are the ones that are coming from the individual Contrada. So that's just another level of exploration that people could kind of pursue with Etna wines if they get to kind of that level 201 of drinking with these, would be to explore the Contrada that way.
Yeah, and I want to bring up that you mentioned when we started the conversation that this region, in your opinion, is right up there with the fine wines of Italy and the fine wines from around the world, especially, when you talk about, well, I'll let you say, when you make that comment, especially the other regions, the big name regions in Italy, how do you compare, how do you rank, or where do you put Etna Rossos and Etna Biancos on that chart?
Equal footing.
Equal footing.
I mean, that's for me, right? Yeah. This is my individual opinion. And the reason for that is I've come to kind of expect more from fine wine regions. Like I really, it's pretty imperative that, you have a white wine in the mix too, and I love the fact that Etna, of those big names, Barolo Barbaresco, Chianti Classico, Brunello di Montalcino, even Valpolicella, they're all red wine regions. And Etna does white wines really well as red wines really well. And if you're talking about complexity, I've had Etna Rosso wines that are every bit as complex as Barolo wines, Brunello wines, Chianti Classico wines. Now, you can make comparisons from one estate to the next, right? Does Etna have the equivalent of Bartolo Mascarello? Does Etna have the equivalent of Biondi Santi? That's a different discussion. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about greatness, right? Like what can a wine region provide that is greatness? And for me, I mean, Etna's it's at that level. It's that top upper echelon in Italian wines for what it provides. And that's not to say that it exceeds Barolo, Brunello, or Chianti Classico. But to me, it's on equal footing because of the potential for excitement, the enthusiasm it generates, and the frequency with which my mind is blown, right?
Yeah.
As a wine lover, that's the thing, right? You know it when you see it, when you have a wine that just, whoa, what is this? I cannot fathom everything that's coming out of this glass right now. It's so much information. And I've had that with all of those wine regions. So why not?
Yeah.
Why say it's any lesser, right? I mean, it's tremendous.
And the other thing I would say is, when you get to fine wine regions, you expect, right? Fine wine, you expect that the price might be a little bit more. When you think about Piemonte or Brunellos, Chianti still has some great value there. But here, I mean, one of my favorite things to do in the exploration of wine is to find those bottles that punch up, that, you drink blind and you go, I'd pay $70 for this, and you get told you're only paying $27 for this, and you're like, holy cow. And I always say it's a wine that takes you to a region, and then once you're there, go explore, because you can find all kinds of things. So my point is there's great value in this region. But Kevin, like all wines made, there's high-end wines. What are we looking at in this region with Etna Rossos? Are we entry level? Are we at $25, $27 like this one, and we get up to $100 bottle, $120 bottles?
Yeah. So the most expensive wine from Etna would be this one I've mentioned 3 or 4 times already, which is Pietra Marina. So kind of unique that one of the most expensive wines is the white wine. But Pietra Marina, it might even be the most expensive in Italy at this point. A quick search on Pietra Marina, I believe it's like $150, $145, kind of in that range per bottle. So that's a collector's wine. It's from a very small but very special vineyard in Milo. On the red wine side of things, you oftentimes get a few wines that kind of, it depends on, producer stature, right? I mean, so many of these wines, a lot of it kind of comes from the fact that it's, from one of the higher end, more prestigious wineries. They can kind of trend up to kind of like the above $100 for some Etna Rosso wines. So I'm thinking like, Tenuta della Terra Nere, like their top level wines would be kind of in that space. But by and large, you can do really, really well at that $35 to $50, $60 range with a whole host of different producers. So, and it's not just all the, the big names that are making great wines. I mean, we've talked about Benanti. Tenuta della Ternera is the work of Mark de Grazia. He was one of the people who came in the 2000s. He's an American importer. He established a winery that really charted a course on the North Slope for red wines. His wines are incredible. So very well regarded. Salvo Foti, who I mentioned earlier, Ivinieri, another great producer. Pietro Dolce, Gracci, those are some of the bigger names, Frank Cornelissen. Those wines are pretty well known by enthusiasts, by sommeliers, by the industry, and they're coveted and sought after. They're kind of in that upper price range. But then there's like kind of this whole other, range of producers that I'm learning about. Some of them are even very new and nascent in their operations. When I was there in September, I met a young couple who started a winery called Monte Leone. And Monte Leone makes excellent whites and reds from the North Slope. It's a very young couple. He's an enologist at Tenuta di Fusina. This is like his side project. They're doing great things. You see these things popping up frequently. There's a sommelier from Milan who started a winery called Federgaziani, and he makes incredible wines, one of which was not part of the Etna DOC, but he found one of these old vineyards that had Gewürztraminer planted in it. So that was folded into his field blend, and then you also find some of these other producers. I mentioned Barone de Villagrande. Their white wine's excellent, but they use acacia wood, so it's got a very different profile to it. Probably one of my absolute favorites is Azienda Agricola Biondi. So Biondi is now on the southeast slope, which is a part of the mountain I haven't really talked a whole lot about. If you check out their website, they've got a video of their vineyard, and this will give you a sense for how extreme these vineyards in Etna can get. It just goes straight up the side of a crater. And it's just layer upon layer of vineyards, just like a wall going up. They have a drone shot that goes over it. Their wines are some of the most unpredictable, most complex, most aromatic, most dazzling wines I've ever had. I love Biondi's wines, and nobody's talking about them, right? So another one of those moments of like, you mentioned earlier, someone was like, oh, don't cover Etna, keep that to ourselves. I'm letting you know a little secret. I mean, Biondi's wines are fantastic. So I love going back there and just reconnecting with this community, discovering new things, checking in on the familiar wines, seeing what that's all about, and then writing about it on opening a bottle, and conveying it to my readers. So, staying on top of those trends is something that's, I think, of all the regions in Italy, that's, again, to go back to that question, it's Etna, it's Chianti Classico, it's Brunello, it's Barolo, Barbaresco. Those are the regions that, I want to stay on top of every year because of how many exciting things are happening there.
Well, I want to close out with two things. Let's first talk about traveling and visiting Sicily. When people go to Italy, I think everybody wants to go to Rome, right? That's where everybody's drawn to. And other than that, it might be the Amalfi Coast. It might be Tuscany is a big draw. But where would you put, we know where you put their wines, where do you put Sicily as a place to visit?
I mean, Sicily's its own thing.
Yeah.
I recently interviewed Valeria Costanzo from Palmento Costanzo, another great Etna winery. She makes some fantastic Etna Bianco in particular. And she repeated something I'd heard said before, which is that Etna is an island within the island, right? So yeah. Etna is its own isolated, elevated portion of Sicily on an island that is way out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, which is completely distinct from Italy. Sicily oftentimes feels like another country. It has just a very different look to it, a little different feel. It can be a little rough around the edges when you're driving around the island. You can come around a bend and there's a giant Greek temple on a hillside. The landscape can be very arid. It can be very, very enchanting. The coastline of Sicily is incredible.
I gotta think that the influence on food has to be pretty good.
Well, the food is very different there as well. I mean, that's another byproduct of its isolation. So Sicily, has had this history that includes the Byzantines, and it includes the Spanish, and it includes the Arabs, and it includes all sorts of people who've crossed its path. The Greeks, they've all left their mark on the cuisine. And, when you're surrounded by the ocean, you get some great seafood, but you also have a lot of these local ingredients that are special to them. I talked about the nuts, the tomatoes that are there, the eggplant. Caponata is a very popular kind of accompaniment to a lot of meals. It's also the rice balls, the arancini, the little street snacks. So it's a really intriguing place to explore culinary wise, because it's just so vastly different than the rest of Italy.
That's awesome.
And the cities are really quite lovely. I've been to Catania, I've been to Palermo. Palermo is really interesting. I mean, it's just, talk about a place that marches to its own beat. It's got a real rhythm to it, and some really interesting sort of spooky architecture. Like there's some darker corners of the monuments there where you're just like, man, what's influencing that? You can go into a chapel there and it's completely covered in gold mosaics on the inside. I mean, Palermo's wild. It's a really wild place to visit. Highly recommend it.
Cool. Well, Kevin, let's finish up with letting everybody know where they can find you, where they can follow you, where they can get your information.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Again, openingabottle.com is my publication. I just celebrated my 10th year writing about wine. As you can probably notice about how I talk about wine, I'm a little bit of a different in the wine industry. I don't do kind of a lot of, reports that are just like consumer reports focused on wines. I really love telling the story. I love getting to the crux of why these things matter. That's really, there's a lot of times in opening a bottle, I'll start writing a story about something and I'll ask myself, does this really matter? Do I need to be writing about this? And I don't. So the content that's on there is I'm really proud of, because I think it's really gets to the heart of the matter on Italian wines, French wines, Austrian wines. I just wrote a piece on a particular grape that grows in Georgia. So I'm just really interested in kind of these ancient places where wine grows and what the story is behind them, but also staying on top of who the right producers are, who we should be drinking, those kinds of things. So it's openingabottle.com. I do have paid subscribers. They can join me for wine classes. They can unlock the paywall that is in front of the wine reviews. And they can also, enjoy some discounts to certain events around the country that I'm working on right now. So looking at brokering some deals for my subscribers. And I came up with a code just for this podcast that they can use if they want to visit and subscribe. They can save 30% off. It's only $49 a year. I mean, I'm not making a great deal of money doing this. Nobody does publishing about wine. But for $49 a year, you get whole access to the site. But with the promo code, you save 30%. And the promo code is all caps FWWP30. So Food, Wine, Whiskey Podcast 30. And they can save money if they want to join me on Opening a Bottle.
And I was going to mention that. That's very nice of you to offer that and extend that to the listeners. And I will say I'm a subscriber to Opening a Bottle, so definitely huge value there. I mean, all the things that you have access to, but not only that, all the live tastings that you get to do. And it's one thing to just drink wine and assess it yourself and give your thoughts. It's really educational and more informative, and you really learn a lot when you can drink a glass with you and other folks who are on the online and really get a perspective or some thoughts from people that you get, these trigger words and things that you go, I didn't get that, but when he said it, now I get it. And it's just so beneficial. So you do some great things on there, but that's one of my favorites is the online classes.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, the online classes are filled with my photos. So, I mean, I really, really want to take people there. And that's something I'm working on too in the future. Just, behind the scenes is how to, lead a travel group over to some of these places to kind of lead a tour. That's something I'd like to really work towards in the coming years is that kind of a thing, because this is the kind of connections that you make with wine. Wine's a great facilitator for getting to understand other cultures and meet other people. And I feel like since I started this journey, I now have friends on the other side of the world that I didn't have before. It's really kind of cool, really kind of cool.
Yeah, that's actually awesome. That's very cool. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on again. Hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. I absolutely enjoy these when we get this opportunity. And I hope the listeners got as much out of this as I did, because I always learn so much when I have you on and get to visit with you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure. And hopefully I'll be checking in on you later about these wines and see how they're doing for you.
Absolutely. Over the next couple of days. Yeah.
Enjoy them. Yeah, enjoy them. Thank you so much. And we'll chat soon.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.